Jake Walker didn't expect to walk out of his father's driveway and find his car gone. He blinked once, then twice, as if his eyes might be playing tricks in the pale Missouri morning light. The old maple across the street rustled like it was snickering. The space where his sedan had been was now just bare concrete, stained faintly from last week's rain. No note on the windshield, because there was no windshield. Behind him, his father's front door creaked open. "They towed it," Mr. Walker said without ceremony. Jake turned, still digesting the scene. "What?" His father stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, steam curling toward the crisp late October sky. He nodded once toward the empty spot. "Lady came by in a beige Prius. Said it was a safety hazard." Jake frowned. "I parked the same way I always do. Facing out, wheels straight." "They said too close to the curb," Mr. Walker added flatly. "Or not close enough. One of those." The morning had started pleasantly. Pine Bluff was quiet on Sundays. At Pine Diner, Jake had ordered his usual, over-easy eggs, rye toast, black coffee, no sugar, while his father read the classifieds and circled something in pen. The waitress called them both Han, like always, and Jake had even chuckled when a regular named Roy launched into a story about raccoons in the church attic. It had been warm in that way only small towns could be. But now, with his car gone and a folded paper on the porch railing, the spell had broken. Jake picked up the citation. Pine Bluff Neighborhood HOA, vehicle removed for safety violation, Section 8.2, Paragraph B. His jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous." "They didn't knock," Mr. Walker said, stepping back inside. Jake followed him into the living room, where the blinds were half open and the smell of pipe tobacco still lingered faintly in the corners. His father set the coffee mug down and reached for a thick, black three-ring binder on the side shelf. It had a hand-labeled spine that simply read HOA Rules. Jake sighed. "You keep that thing?" "I keep everything," Mr. Walker replied, flipping pages. "Some things aren't meant to rust." Jake leaned over to look. The print was small, double-spaced, and dry as sand. His father tapped a page. "They're supposed to give 72 hours notice for minor violations. Unless it's an emergency." Jake pointed at the citation. "Doesn't say anything about that." Mr. Walker simply nodded. From outside, a voice called, "Y'all need a lawyer, or a bigger car." Jake turned to see Bethany Nguyen leaning over the porch rail from her side yard, her phone already in hand. She wore an oversized hoodie and plaid pajama pants, a camera slung around her neck. 25, savvy, always watching. She gave a lazy salute. "I caught it on video if you want." HOA lady didn't even flinch when the truck backed in. Jake managed a laugh that didn't quite stick. "We might need that." Bethany grinned. "Tank it up, Mr. Walker," she called, and disappeared behind her fence. That night, Jake stayed late, sipping leftover coffee while his father sat in his recliner with a legal pad on his knee. The TV was on mute. A small table lamp cast long, slow-moving shadows on the ceiling. The room felt like a war room from a quieter era. "They've done this before," Jake said eventually. "To the Nelsons. To the guy with the koi pond." Mr. Walker didn't look up. He reached for a pencil, sharpened it with a few methodical twists, then opened a drawer and pulled out a beige folder. On the front, written in small black letters, were the words, "Tank Permit." Jake stared. "Wait, what?" His father stood without answering, walked to the hall closet, and pulled on a canvas jacket. Without a word, he crossed the living room, opened the back door, and stepped outside. Jake followed, curiosity outweighing confusion now. The air had cooled further, and a thin haze had settled over the yard. They walked past the tool shed, around a patch of dormant rose bushes, until they reached the detached garage that hadn't been opened in years. Walter reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and slid it into the lock. There was a low groan as the metal door lifted, stuttering slightly, then rolling all the way up with a hollow clank. Inside, dim and quiet, sat a long, oblong shape covered in canvas. Dust shimmered in the beam of the motion sensor light. Walter heads to the garage. A dusty tarp lifts just slightly. By Monday, the tank was parked exactly where the HOA told people not to park. It rested like a quiet dare across Walter Walker's driveway, just far enough from the curb to be legal, just close enough to be provocative. The tracks were clean, the paint matte and undisturbed, the flag magnets still fluttering on the right side under the morning breeze. Walter stood beside it in his brown jacket, holding a folded newspaper and sipping weak diner coffee from a white styrofoam cup. The street was silent but for the occasional squirrel and the hum of leaf blowers. At 8:03 a.m., a beige SUV came into view. Karen Kirby exited briskly, her shoes clicking against the sidewalk like punctuation marks. She clutched a leather binder so tight the edges dug into her palm. A red scarf flapped dramatically around her shoulders though the air was hardly brisk. She slowed as she caught sight of the tank. For a moment, she just stared. Then her lips parted as if preparing to speak, but nothing came out. Walter flipped to the editorial page and adjusted his glasses. "You can't be serious," she said, voice sharp but strained. Walter didn't look up. "This violates the spirit of the rules," Karen continued, tone rising. "This is intimidation." Walter turned a page. Karen took out her phone and snapped several photos from different angles, muttering to herself. Then she stormed into the HOA office next door, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the blinds. From across the street, Bethany stood casually on her porch with a mug in one hand and her phone in the other. "And here we go," she whispered to her camera. She wasn't live streaming this time. She wanted better angles. By noon, the HOA board was convened in the same multipurpose room where they usually hosted potlucks and CPR training. Folding chairs lined up in hasty rows. The air smelled faintly of Lysol and cinnamon-scented air freshener. Karen stood at the front, visibly rattled. Her hair was pulled tighter than usual, and the red scarf had been replaced with a rigid gray blazer. "We are gathered under emergency protocol," she began, her voice tight, "to discuss a disruptive and unprecedented violation of our community standards." A murmur passed through the room. Several board members exchanged glances. Paul Dennison, the treasurer, cleared his throat and said, "Technically, Miss Kirby, the vehicle is registered and falls under historical exemption." "Technically," Karen snapped, "we're a residential neighborhood, not a museum." Walter, seated near the back, remained expressionless. Jake sat beside him, arms crossed, while Bethany leaned against the wall, phone lowered but recording audio. Her expression was unreadable but not unfriendly. Karen clicked through a slideshow of blurry photos of the tank. "This is not an appropriate presence in a peaceful subdivision. We must act to preserve the tone of Pine Bluff." Paul shifted in his seat. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A retroactive clause," Karen said. "Banning all military-grade vehicles from being parked within property lines. Effective immediately." A beat of silence passed. "That's not how clauses work," muttered Joanne Fisher, the HOA secretary. Karen turned to the HOA's attorney, a man named Mr. Harold James who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He adjusted his tie and spoke with practiced calm. "As of now, there is no legal basis to demand removal. Mr. Walker's registration is current. The HOA has no explicit ban on historically registered vehicles. Any retroactive action would be subject to challenge." Karen's voice rose. "But it's a tank." Walter raised his eyes from the sports section. "And it's legal." When the HOA opened the floor, they didn't expect the whole town to show up, with receipts. Rows of metal folding chairs filled the multipurpose room of Pine Bluff's community center, their rubber feet squeaking gently on the linoleum floor as neighbors shuffled in. The air smelled faintly of instant coffee, old paper, and cinnamon sugar cookies someone had left out too early. A bulletin board in the back corner still bore flyers from last spring's bake sale and a flyer about CPR classes dated 2018. Karen Kirby stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, blazer pressed sharp, jaw tighter than the ponytail at the back of her neck. She tapped the microphone twice. It let out a soft screech that turned a few heads. Thank you all for coming, she said, voice carefully measured. Let's keep our comments civil and brief. In the front row, Walter Walker sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, a navy blue folder balanced on his knee. Jake sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Bethany leaned against the back wall, hoodie half-zipped, phone out but idle. Walter leaned slightly toward his son. Let the rules do the talking, he murmured. We'll just sit front row. Karen began her remarks with a brisk review of neighborhood harmony, noting rising tensions and what she referred to as symbolic disruptions. She didn't name the tank, but everyone knew. She rattled off citations, loosely referenced bylaws, and spoke of the need for uniformity. But then she opened the floor. The first to rise was Joanne Fisher, a retired librarian with 3 cats and an encyclopedic memory for dates. You fined me $65 for hanging a flag on my porch that was an inch too long, she said, voice even. You measured it. With a tape measure. While I was out grocery shopping. Karen blinked. That was June 4th, Joanne added. Tuesday. From there, it snowballed. A man in overalls spoke of being cited for having unauthorized garden decor, a plastic duck. A single mom mentioned being told to repaint her mailbox for being too cheerful. Then Mr. and Mrs. Nelson stood. We've lived here 32 years, Mrs. Nelson began, clutching her cardigan tightly. Last spring, we put a bench in our front yard. Just a little wooden bench with a brass plate on it for my late husband. Her voice shook. 2 weeks later, we got a letter, fine, demand for removal, threat of lien. Karen opened her mouth, but the room had changed. Faces once blank or indifferent now leaned forward. Even those who'd never received a letter themselves began to murmur. Bethany stepped forward. If it pleased the room, she said, holding her phone like a microphone, I've got a short video queued up. Karen raised her hand. Now wait. The clip played anyway. Karen's voice, caught in a sharp, grainy clip, berating a neighbor about wind chimes that cause auditory disturbance. The video ended on a close-up of the woman she'd confronted, just standing there, silent, holding a baby monitor. A long pause followed. Walter cleared his throat and opened the folder on his lap. He rose slowly, adjusted his glasses, and stepped toward the microphone. Without commentary, he began to read. Section 5.3, Registered vehicles of historical significance shall be exempt from residential parking limitations, provided said vehicle is maintained in accordance with state law. No emotion. Just facts. He turned the page. Section 9.2, Citations may not be issued retroactively. Another page. Section 2.1, The HOA shall uphold the dignity, safety, and autonomy of all homeowners, with fairness and transparency. He paused and looked up. The word autonomy appears 9 times, he said. Not once does it mention decor, flags, ducks, or tank treads. A quiet rustle passed through the crowd, like wind over corn. Paul Dennison, the HOA vice president, cleared his throat. I think perhaps it's time we consider a temporary suspension of leadership while a formal review is conducted. Karen's head snapped toward him. Paul. We'll vote, someone said from the back. Karen turned toward the room, eyes wide. You don't understand what you're risking. But she didn't finish. Karen storms out of the meeting. Walter folds the bylaws and says, they're finally reading. A tank outside your office is one thing. But your HOA board turning on you? That's war. Karen Kirby sat stiffly at her roll-top desk, framed by faux wood paneling and a stack of HOA newsletters still warm from the home printer. Her hands hovered over her keyboard like they didn't trust her anymore. The cursor blinked inside a Word document titled Community Unity Update. The font was Comic Sans. She didn't notice. Her home office overlooked the street, blinds cracked just enough to catch movement. Across the road, Walter Walker trimmed his hedges with slow, deliberate strokes. A veteran's cap shielded his brow from the afternoon sun. He didn't look up. Karen returned to the screen, chewing her bottom lip. The newsletter she'd written wasn't long, 3 paragraphs of vaguely encouraging language about preserving neighborhood traditions and ensuring aesthetic standards. But in tone, it read like a half-apology laced with warning. She called the tank symbolic non-compliance, labeled Walter's supporters momentarily misled, and implied future rules would fix confusing loopholes. She emailed it to the distribution list at 3:12 p.m. By 4:06, Bethany had posted a screenshot with the caption, "This aged like milk." By 6 p.m., the town Facebook page had over 200 comments, some snarky, some furious, many sharing their own stories. One man wrote, "My son's basketball hoop was taken down without notice. Guess I'm a threat too." Bethany's montage clip went viral overnight. Her narration was even, but her choice of images sharp. Walter sipping coffee beside the tank, Karen mid-lecture at the emergency HOA meeting, Mrs. Nelson holding a photo of her bench plaque. Hashtags took over, #TankDad, #HOA victims, #Pine Bluff Parade. By Thursday morning, the HOA vice president, Paul Dennison, quietly submitted his resignation, citing a shift in community values and a personal discomfort with current proceedings. He left a note on the bulletin board next to the diner's pie list. Someone circled it in blue pen. At the diner, Walter sat at the counter like always. He didn't comment. Just nodded when the waitress asked if he wanted his usual. He stirred his coffee slowly, glanced at the folded newspaper beside his plate, and listened as 2 older gentlemen behind him debated whether Bethany's latest post was satire or documentary. Back at her house, Karen scrolled through the Facebook comments with tight lips and a clenched jaw. Her long post the night before, 3 paragraphs of defense mixed with regret, ending with a plea for community patience, had backfired. The comments were no longer just criticism. They were stories. They were patterns. A young mom wrote, "You find me for sidewalk chalk. My daughter was 5. An elderly man added, "I removed my wind chimes after being told they were hostile. I served 2 tours overseas." Karen slammed her laptop shut. Friday came with a knock on her door, not loud, but firm. A folded letter slid through the mail slot, embossed with the HOA seal. She opened it slowly. Effective immediately, it began, "Janet Kirby is hereby suspended from her duties as HOA president pending a full review and community vote, to be held within 7 days. This measure is taken under Clause 3.9 of Emergency Community Governance Standards." Her hands trembled. Not with rage, but with something colder. Something harder to name. Later that evening, Bethany posted a new video, less polished, more intimate. Just her voice over stills from the neighborhood, a dog tied to a mailbox, a rainbow flag gently swaying on a porch, a rusted bench with leaves gathered at its base. She spoke plainly. Power doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it crumbles. The tank rolled again, but this time, down Main Street, with applause instead of outrage. It moved slowly, like a memory. The sun had just crested over the rooftops of Pine Bluff, casting long golden streaks down the centerline. Flags fluttered from storefronts, some faded from years past, others freshly hung. Folding chairs lined both sides of the street, dotted with families bundled in flannel, sipping from travel mugs and shielding their eyes. Walter Walker sat behind the wheel of the M5 Stuart, the brim of his service cap pulled low. His uniform jacket, pressed and clean, bore only a single set of ribbons and his name patch. Jake sat beside him in the passenger seat, holding a modest banner across his lap, printed in plain block letters, "Community Over Control." The tank didn't roar. It hummed, a careful, well-oiled whisper rolling past barber shops and the hardware store, past the bakery with the turkey-shaped cookies in the window. Children stood and waved. A few saluted. One boy clutched a hand-drawn sign that read, "Thank you, Mr. Tank Man." Bethany walked alongside, live-streaming with one hand while steadying her gimbal with the other. She wore a beanie and fingerless gloves, eyes focused not on the tank, but the faces watching it pass. Every now and then, she'd angle the lens toward the crowd, a veteran standing with his hat off, a mother wiping her eyes, a teenage girl tapping the share button. Viewers clicked in by the thousands. On the second floor of a pale yellow house, behind lace curtains, Karen Kirby stood motionless. The red scarf hung limply around her neck. She didn't wave. She didn't open the window. She just watched as the tank passed, and below, two volunteers unscrewed the HOA sign from its front post. At the end of Main Street, the parade looped into the parking lot of the Pine Bluff Community Center. There was no stage, no speeches, just folding tables with lemonade, slices of apple pie, and slow country music playing from an old speaker. Veterans sat together in clusters, quiet but content. Walter parked the tank under the flagpole and stepped down with Jake's help. The crowd shifted to make space, but no one rushed. A man from the city council, wearing a windbreaker and carrying a clipboard, approached and handed Walter a small wooden plaque. In quiet defense of our community, it read. No speech. Just a nod. Walter accepted it with a small smile and a handshake. He didn't linger. As the sun dipped behind the old church steeple, Walter climbed back into the tank. Jake coiled the banner and tucked it behind the seat. Bethany gave a thumbs up without words and turned off the stream. They drove back through town without ceremony. In the driveway, Walter parked slowly, engine cooling like a long exhale. He stepped out, stretched his back, and looked up at the fading sky. As Walter loads the tank back into his garage, he says softly, "Now let's plant something new." Karen didn't pack boxes so much as she erased herself, one drawer at a time. The HOA office had never looked like much. A corner room in the back of the community center, half its walls lined with file cabinets, the other half with dry erase boards bearing scribbles from long-forgotten subcommittees. Karen moved slowly across the space, her steps muffled by a patchy beige carpet. She didn't make lists. She didn't speak. She just opened drawers, removed papers, and placed them into a cardboard box with the same care one might use to carry glass figurines. The room was quiet. No one had shown up to say goodbye. The nameplate still sat on her desk, Janet Kirby, HOA president in gold-toned script. It looked oddly formal now, like something meant for a play that had ended. Outside the window, frost had settled on the grass. A man in a stocking cap jogged by, not glancing toward the building. Across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson walked their spaniel. Karen saw them clearly through the window. Mr. Nelson had his hands in his pockets, his wife wore a blue scarf. Neither of them looked her way. When they passed, she looked down again. She lifted the nameplate and turned it in her hand, staring at the faint smudge near the corner where she'd once spilled coffee. Then, after a beat, she dropped it into the box. It landed without a sound. Back home, she passed the hall mirror without glancing in. The kitchen was cold. Mail had stacked on the counter untouched. She set the box on the table and stood a long while, staring at the spot where she'd once kept an orchid that never bloomed. That afternoon, she walked to the community bulletin board near Pine Bluff's small park. Flyers had already gone up for the Thanksgiving potluck. The topmost one caught her eye, a bright poster with hand-drawn leaves around the edges and the heading Neighborhood Picnic, Reconnect and Rebuild. Below it, in smaller letters, Honorary Host, Walter Walker. Karen reached out but didn't touch the flyer. Her hand hovered for a second before falling back to her side. As she turned away, she passed two younger moms pushing strollers. Their conversation didn't pause. She was invisible now, not even an interruption. At home, she sat at her desk again and opened her laptop. The Pine Bluff Facebook group loaded with the usual delay. She scrolled without logging in. The top post was Bethany's latest. A simple black screen faded into the words, "Power is borrowed. Respect is earned." The clip played over shots from the Veterans Day parade, kids waving flags, Walter adjusting his jacket, the tank moving slowly like a memory through town. Karen watched it all. The comments section was hundreds long. None of them mentioned her name. She closed the laptop, gently this time, and looked around the room. It no longer looked like her office. It looked like a borrowed space, ready to be returned. Before leaving, she walked through the hallway once more, checking nothing. The lights were already off. She didn't lock the door behind her. Outside, a fresh layer of frost had coated the sidewalk. She pulled her coat tighter and glanced down to where a square of chalk color peeked from beneath a bush. She stepped closer. A child's handwriting, wobbly but proud, curved around a chalk drawing of a tank. Next to it, in pale pink letters, "Tank Man is my grandpa's hero." Karen paused, then walked away. The tank had been parked for good, but something stronger had taken its place. In Walter Walker's backyard, a small raised garden sat square and neat, its wooden frame sanded smooth, soil dark and loose, tufts of rosemary and thyme sprouting along the back edge. A few wooden markers stood along the rows, handwritten labels, each in Walter's careful script. The sun was low, late November gold filtering through brittle branches. The tank was gone now, rolled back into the garage with no plans of return. Walter knelt slowly, gloved hands pulling a stubborn weed near the turnips. His breath moved visible in the air. Behind him, a folding table sat under a maple tree, topped with 2 chipped plates, a pot of warm tea, and a pecan pie still in its box. Jake arrived without knocking. He paused at the back gate, lifted the latch, and stepped inside. The pie balanced in one hand, a thick scarf wrapped sloppily around his neck. "No HOA rules about pie, right?" he asked. Walter didn't stand right away. He finished pulling the weed, wiped his palms on his knees, then turned with a small smile. "Not yet." Jake set the box on the table and sat down with a soft grunt. "Smells better out here than Mom's old Yankee candles." They didn't speak for a while. Just sipped tea, the kind that steeped slowly and needed no sugar. Walter's uniform jacket hung nearby on a peg, cleaned, pressed, but in use today. His cap rested on the table edge, its emblem faded with age. A knock sounded from the gate. Bethany poked her head through. "Just me." Walter waved her in without standing. Jake gestured to the extra chair, which she declined. "Can't stay." "Got dinner at my aunt's," she said, then reached into her coat and pulled out a flash drive. She set it beside the pie. The final cut. Tank Truths, The Quiet Rebellion. It's 28 minutes. Light music, no dramatics. I interviewed the Nelsons. Walter looked at it like one might regard a seed packet, curious, reserved. "Thanks," he said. Bethany nodded, gave a mock salute, and backed out the gate with a smile. The afternoon drifted, the way quiet things do when nothing urgent presses in. Birds hopped along the fence. A dog barked 2 blocks over. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes played a hesitant tune. Jake stood and stretched. "I was thinking, might build a bench back here." Walter raised an eyebrow. Jake shrugged. "Nothing fancy. Just somewhere to sit." "Figured it's time." Walter nodded. That was answer enough. Later, when the light dipped just past orange and the shadows lengthened, Jake returned with a small wooden sign. He'd carved it that morning in his garage, kept it simple. Just 3 words, clean lines, hung by twine. He hammered it gently into the soil at the garden's edge. "Honor lives here." They sat together after that, neither speaking much. Walter poured the last of the tea. Jake broke a slice of pie in half with his fork. The leaves rustled. Walter, sitting with tea, whispers, "Not bad for parking legally." Camera fades as wind rustles the rosemary. The old tank no longer rumbled through town, but its presence lingered in the garden it left behind, quiet, steady, and unmistakably earned. What began as a simple act of parking became a reminder that dignity doesn't need a loud voice to be heard. When rules become weapons, it takes a community, not noise, to disarm them. Sometimes, the most powerful protest is a peaceful presence. And maybe, just maybe, change starts with someone willing to stand still when the rest rush to control. Like a rosemary sprout pushing through fall soil, respect grows strongest when rooted in resolve.